Well, he wasn't on his own making the decision because obviously Ben is one of our pundits, but some of you may or may not know Ben is also on the Tigers board. He's one of the directors. So we're going to ask you these questions now, Ben, not as a pundit, as a board member, OK? Yeah. OK, so we all know Matt O'Connor has been released from his job. He was released on Monday. He'd been in the role for 18 months, but he was released after one Premiership game of a brand new season. It's not something I don't think we're used to in the Premiership, is it? So
it's not, and it wasn't a decision that was taken lightly. The finish towards the end of last year wasn't acceptable by Leicester's standards. Matt agreed with that. He said it wasn't acceptable. There was obviously a review at the end of the year, so it's not just down to one result. In fact, actually losing away at Exeter wouldn't have caused this to happen solely on its own. But during that review, a number of areas were highlighted, and involved in that review were a number of the senior players, the whole coaching staff, members of the rugby committee that sit on the board, and actions were put forward to how we could ensure that didn't happen again next season. And Matt agreed those actions. He came up with a lot of the actions himself, and just the manner of the performance on Saturday meant that the board came away feeling that those actions hadn't been acted on and the agreed path forward hadn't been acted on. And the easy thing to do would have been to leave it for a few weeks and see, but I think once the decision had been made, it would have been far less embarrassing for the club to leave it for a few weeks. But actually, once you make that decision, you've just got to get on with it, and you've got to actually think of the future and think of the path you're going to take, and give the next person the time to actually make a difference. But
yeah, I think from the outside, you're saying, he had time to do the things that he told you after the review. But it kind of seems to us that maybe you as a board had something in your mind anyway during that summer period that he wasn't the right person for the job. So if that was the case, why wasn't that decision made after Leicester lost to Newcastle?
That's understandable. I take that. But actually, the decision hadn't been made. He was very strong in that review as to how he could fix things so it wouldn't happen again. Now, a lot of the reasons that we talked about in the commentary on Saturday for Leicester's performance, if you sort of search back to where they came from, it really does fall at the head coach's feet, which is the fitness of the players. Now, I'm not saying the Leicester players aren't fit, but actually in terms of being match prepared. So getting that balance right in pre-season is very important. You don't want to tire your players out so they die towards the end of the season. But equally, there were players in that Leicester team, that 4 players who started that game who had no pre-season minutes in their legs. And that became very apparent. And then the style of play and the game plan actually probably played into Exeter's hands a little bit. And so there were just some slight concerns about those areas that we'd all agreed were going to be addressed that actually they patently hadn't been addressed going into this game.
Okay. Leicester Tigers had an unheralded period of stability and success under Richard Cockerell, but ever since his departure, it feels as if that Leicester are still searching for their new DNA and not quite sure of who they are. And I guess, has that been reflected in not knowing who the right person is to take Leicester going forward? A little bit. I totally agree that it sort of seemed more flux. And when you don't have success in terms of a playing style and identity that you're talking about, Leicester was always built on a forward-dominated game. And perhaps there was, towards the end of the Richard Cockerell era, an idea that actually perhaps you needed to expand the game a little bit more. The fact that there've been, people are quoting that Leicester have had 4 directors of rugby, or they're not directors of rugby, head coaches. Richard Cockerell was a director of rugby, the other guys head coaches. But actually, Aaron was never the head coach. He was acting head coach or the interim head coach while we did the review. And he was one of the candidates that could have been taken forward, but he was part of the Richard Cockerell regime. It was decided that he would be almost a caretaker manager like you'd have in football while you made the right decision. Matt was brought in because he actually wasn't part of the initial shortlist. So he approached the club, as all coaches do when they know there's a vacancy, but he approached the club as someone that knew Leicester very well, had been very successful there, been a big part of why Richard Cockerell had success, and that team worked very well together. And he said, I'm the person to take this forward. When we listened to him, we actually agreed. What we needed at that time was someone to settle the ship very quickly,
the criticism of the end of Cockers' regime, but coupled with Aaron, was that there were mixed messages and the players sort of didn't know which style of play they were. He came in and did exactly what we asked of him, which was to settle the ship. Yeah. And we also said, we've still got time to qualify for the semi-finals. He did that and was 60 seconds away from getting to the final. Yeah. I think where he hasn't kicked on was the second part of that role, was to plan for the future and how Leicester go about the future and get better from the position that we'd slipped to. And I think that's an area that he hasn't quite managed to. And funnily enough, the areas that he's so strong at, which got him into that semi-final, nearly made the final, that sort of autocratic is often used as a negative word, but sometimes it's needed, someone to stand up and say, this is the direction we're going in. But perhaps towards the end, there was a little bit of a feeling that some of the other voices weren't being heard, that we were offering good advice. And all, you know, so that might have been an area that contributed to it.